Soundset, how's it going? Thanks so much for tuning in and welcome to the second episode of Jan's Patchwork Corner, in which I talk about how to get a synthesizer to make the sounds that you hear in your head. I'm Jan Morgenstern from Treeswift Audio, and this isn't just the second episode overall, but also the continuation of our first multi-parter, which might be becoming a pattern. I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, we're still in the middle of recreating my patch Bioluminescence from my soundset Zebra Elemental's ISLA for Yuhi Zebra 2 that you can get as always from treeswiftaudio.com. Use offer code QuiltMaster for 10% off. And in the last episode, we took care of the tonal foundation of this patch and went through the modules that are creating the basic pad sound that this thing is resting on. In this episode, there's a little bit more patching to do, but for the most part, I will be talking about effects. And that might just work as its own self-contained episode, but that being said, the references that I'm going to make and the explanations on how that stuff fits into the bigger picture of this patch will make more sense if you've seen the first episode. So if you haven't done that already, then I recommend that you check that out first. All right, less talking, more patching. Or, patching and talking. Or talking with a little bit of... You know what? Let's just jump right in. Enjoy. So let's kick things off with a quick recap on where we left it off in the last episode. We had this fairly basic but kind of pleasant and silky smooth, darkish string sound going that's coming out of a single oscillator, although one that is putting out a pretty fat stack of 11 detuned voices per note, and that we've set to give us a spectrum that still fairly closely resembles that of a sawtooth wave, although one that is also pretty drastically pre-filtered down to its lowest partials, like its lowest harmonics. So in other words, it has a lot less brilliance than an actual sawtooth wave. And we're feeding that signal straight into a standard 4-pole low-pass filter, no resonance. There's a little bit of filter modulation going on, courtesy of our second envelope here. That's giving us this slight bump in intensity at the beginning of a note. That's also responding to the velocity of what I'm playing a little bit. And finally, I can open that filter manually with the mod wheel. And on that note, before we get into the actual meat of this episode, there's one more small bit of housekeeping that I didn't get around to last time. And that concerns this massive jump in volume that we're getting when I open the filter. So you might remember that in the last episode, the default cutoff frequency of our filter kind of kept creeping down, right? I kept making it darker and darker because I'm kind of a little bit of a sucker for the fact that the sound is really focusing most of its energy in those first couple harmonics. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. The issue here is that our filter's cutoff frequency is now so low that it's also affecting the amplitudes of our fundamental frequency and the first couple harmonics. And we can verify that in the frequency plot. When I open the filter, you can see that it's also the first couple partials that are rising in level. And like in most complex and harmonic waveforms, those are the partials with the largest amplitudes, meaning that is kind of where our overall output level is coming from. And this creates the situation that if we move the filter's cutoff frequency up ever so slightly, it will then leave those first couple frequencies through unattenuated, and that of course is giving us this irritating bump in volume. And I don't want to steamroll that entirely because it kind of makes sense. After all, we are letting through more energy through the filter when we open it. It's just a little bit too much, right? Kind of makes things hard, a little bit hard and unruly to manage. So let's figure out what to do against that. And first of all, I want to get a general sense of the overall output levels that we're putting out. Ooh. Okay. I think there's other stuff in our gain staging structure that might need improvement. So I think another problem is that we might be hitting our filter a little bit too hard, that the input level of our filter, or i.e. the output level of our oscillator, is a little bit too high overall, which would also explain why the filter is constantly adding some grunge and some overdrive to our sound. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to just pull the output level of our oscillator down. Okay, and that sounds and looks more healthy to me. But of course, it doesn't change anything about the issue at hand, because in order to tame that, we're going to have to dynamically lower the volume as we open the filter, or in other words, set up a modulation that will do that. And that's fairly straightforward. I just have to take the same controller that I used to open the filter, i.e. the mod wheel, and use it to set up a second modulation, a negative one, that will lower the output volume of the patch. But which volume? Because even with a simple patch like this, there's like half a dozen points in Zebra's signal flow where we could be adjusting the volume. And I want to modulate this here control, which is the output volume of whatever output signal will end up being fed into our first audio lane. Or in this constellation, it means that we're going to be directly modulating the output level of our filter. All right, so I'm going to select the mod wheel here and set up a negative modulation on this volume control and see what that gives us. And you can probably tell that that pretty much takes the sting out of this kind of irritating volume ramp up or build up, and it's now a lot more kind of predictable and easier to handle. It's not an optimal solution, because the thing is that the relationship between our filter cutoff and the level that we're getting is very much nonlinear. And as a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that the entirety of this offensive bump in volume occurs entirely in this region of our modulation range, like in the lowest third, right? And once we're past that, then the rest of the scale, even without that modulation in place, kind of feels much more predictable and linear to me. And that kind of makes sense, because this is the range, that critical range where we are moving the filter cutoff away from our fundamental and the early harmonics, and where we're getting all this sudden level buildup. So unfortunately, this volume control and also our modulation source both have a linear characteristic. And what that means is that no matter where I set the modulation depth here, I will never fully get rid of this effect. Like, the best I could do is maybe I could increase the scale of that modulation, and that would kind of let me cover up that early bump. But then I would be sucking all the dynamics out of that process, and like almost get a weird kind of inverse relationship in the upper ranges. So that's clearly no good. So the optimal solution here would be if we set up this modulation with a modulation source that is nonlinear in a way that more closely matches the characteristic of this relationship between our cutoff and our level. But we still want to use the mod wheel to control the whole thing, right? That's kind of the point. So we need to kind of change the characteristic of that mod wheel source. And the go-to way to do that in Zebra is by redirecting it through an mmap table. And I'm using mmap tables extensively in the third layer, so I'm going to go into much more detail about what they are and how they work. Then, for now, just a bird's eye view. In the mode that we're going to be using here, the mmap tables allow you to take any modulation source in Zebra and reshape their signal into pretty much whatever you want. And the way this works is that the mmap table, the mmap module, once again gives me this kind of canvas on which I can draw some kind of curve. And you can think of this as a kind of transfer curve where the input value from your original modulation source is being mapped to the x-axis. And if you then use the mmap module itself as the actual modulation source, it will keep outputting whatever values I set the bars to in the region, in the position that corresponds to the input value from my original source. So if I'm selecting my mod wheel as the input source here, then you can get a graphical sense of what's happening here, right? So input value on the x-axis, output value on the y-axis. And I kind of have a feeling that the curve that we would be looking for would look something like this, probably. So that I'm getting, as I start moving the mod wheel, I'm fairly quickly getting a pretty drastic dip in volume, which then, once I'm past that initial bump, turns into a much more gentle and flatter curve, right? And fortunately, I don't have to apply my subpar art skills here because the mmap module comes with a helpful list of curve presets, and one of them looks like that, which doesn't just look close enough, but also clean. So that's looking good, except for one detail. Our mod wheel, like any continuous MIDI controller, is a unipolar modulation source, meaning that we will only ever get positive values from it. It happens in the range between 0 and 100. The mmap module is intelligent and knows that we're using a unipolar module and or a unipolar modulation source, and it maps the positive half of the input range to the entirety of its x-axis. But as you can easily tell here, the first quarter or so of our output volume map has negative values in it, which means that with this kind of curve, we are also converting our unipolar into a bipolar source. And I don't really want to deal with that because I set my modulation up with a unipolar signal in mind. And that's an easy fix. I can just use the make unipolar function here that will just rescale all the output values so that they're all in the positive half of the range. Okay, so let's see what that does for us. I'm going to return to my original def. And this feels much more natural to me. Like I can't really tell that there's that initial bump anymore. Kind of just feels predictable and organic over the entirety of the range. So that kind of fixes the problem. All right, so with that in the bag, let's actually call it a wrap on the synthesis part of our first layer and start asking ourselves why this still doesn't sound all that impressive. Because don't get me wrong, I'm perfectly happy with the basic sound. It's just that it sounds a little bit basic. And to figure out why, it kind of helps to be aware that whatever synth pad you might have heard or played coming out of a reasonably modern synth in the past, let's say 20, 25 years, had a fairly high chance of relying at least to some extent on effects to achieve its sound. Because there's just some things that you can easily achieve with effects that are either hard, if not impossible, to replicate with standard synth modules on a per voice basis, or just don't make a whole lot of sense on the per voice layer of a synth. And just for reference, when I talk about effects in this context, I mean any kind of audio processing that takes place in the signal chain after the principal synthesis of your separate voices has been finished, has been completed, and the signals from your separate voices have been summed together and are now waiting, often in the form of like a summed stereo signal on some kind of common signal bus. Okay, so let's have a look into effects. In my experience with a relatively vanilla synth pad sound like this, the three types of effects that you're most likely to encounter will be modulation, your phasers, your choruses, your flangers. Reverb is a biggie, and delay can be fairly useful. Well, and something like a master EQ is always nice to have to, make final tweaks to the overall tonal balance that you want out of your patch. So let's go over those in detail real quick, and real quick. Yeah, that's gonna happen. And see if we can come up with a basic effects chain that makes sense for this kind of patch. And I'm going to start with modulation. So Zebra's modulation engine is preset to give us a chorus, and that sounds like this. And a chorus is something that I feel that I'm seeing more often as I go a little bit back in synth history. And I believe that's because functionally what a chorus does is it kind of creates new voices out of thin air, more or less. And it does that by making a copy of your input signal and then delaying that in time a little bit, usually not much more than something to the tune of like 15 to 35, 40 milliseconds. And then it keeps changing that delay time back and forth. And whenever you do that, whenever you apply a continuous modulation on the time of a delay line, you're also causing a change in pitch, because you're essentially, as long as you're moving that delay time around, you're essentially creating a Doppler effect. So if you keep wiggling that delay time back and forth in the shape of, let's say, a sine wave, what you're essentially doing is you're creating an artificial vibrato on your signal. And you can do that a couple of times in parallel and keep your modulation phases shuffled up, and then mix everything together, and then you're going to get this like thick, slightly detuned mush. And if you then blend that mush tastefully, hopefully, with your original unprocessed signal, you're getting something that is fairly close in effect to what we've been doing by applying that tuning spread, like that detuning effect, to the voices in our oscillator stack. In other words, if you're trying to get an ensemble sound out of a synth that doesn't just let you throw actual voices against the problem until it's no longer a problem, then your next best bet is often to go with a smaller number of voices and then thicken things up in post with a chorus effect. But of course, that's not a problem that we have in Zebra. And like matter of fact, we arguably already have like a borderline unreasonable number of actual voices on every node. And I kind of feel like slapping a chorus on top of that is gilding the lily a little bit. So, gilding the lily? Painting the lily? Painting the rose? I know what I mean. So let's check out what else is on offer and see what a phaser can do for us. So in its default state, that sounds like this. And a phaser is built out of all-pass filters. And an all-pass filter is a filter whose only purpose is to mess with the phases in your signal, or with the phase relationships of the frequencies in your signal. So I was mentioning it briefly in the last episode that is something that you're getting with any kind of filter, or at least any kind that you're going to find in a synth. The fact that in addition to cutting out pieces or cutting out parts of your frequency spectrum, they will also always change the phases in your signal. Or in other words, they will push around the positions in time of the waveforms of your frequencies by varying amounts depending on where those frequencies are in relationship to the filter's cutoff point. And whereas with your common household filters, your low passes, high passes, band passes, that always comes just as a more or less desirable side effect. With an all-pass filter, it's all you're getting. It will leave the amplitudes of your frequencies alone. It will only do this phase shift. And as long as you're listening only to the output signal of an all-pass filter, it's possible that you're not going to hear all that much of a difference unless it's wildly swinging around. The magic part comes when you start blending that phase-shifted version of your signal together with the original unprocessed signal, because at that point, the phase-shifted frequencies will start interacting with the original frequencies. And in parts of the frequency spectrum where that phase shift done by the all-pass filters approaches 180 degrees, or in other words, where the shifted versions of your frequencies are out of phase with the original frequencies, they will cancel each other out. And that will give you these kind of notches or dips in the frequency spectrum. And depending on how many all-pass filters and what kinds you're stringing together, you can combine these dips into more complex kind of wavy patterns that you can overlay across your spectrum. And of course, at that point, you can start modulating the whole thing and waving it around to get just another layer of spectral movement in your sound. All right, so let's have a quick look what Zebra's phaser can do for us. And a good idea, a good way to figure out what anything built out of filters can do to your spectrum is to briefly replace your signal with just a pink noise, something like that. And okay, I'm gonna make some adjustments to this just to keep it from modulating, something like that maybe. So that's our unprocessed signal, and here's an even mix of the phase shifted and the original signal. So we're getting so that's only the all pass output. So we're getting the maximum effect when we have like an even mix of our original and the process signal. And with the center knob, I can place those two dips somewhere in the spectrum where I want them, where they hopefully do the most good. Okay, so let's see what that can do for our actual sound. So with the center control lets me position those two dips wherever I want them. And I want them to mostly stay away from our fundamentals and maybe like first couple harmonics, and instead play around with the upper harmonics where they can't do that much damage to the actual tonal balance of the sound. And that I can only do relatively approximately. So because remember, that's our phaser is living on the master bus, which means that all our voices have been mixed together already, and there's no way for us to follow along with the actual pitch that we're playing. But for like the meaty middle range, where I expect most of our where I expect our patch will be mostly used, I can just place them somewhere in the upper harmonics. And when I'm happy with that, I can start modulating them a little bit. And that's much too fast for my taste. I'm gonna go down on the speed. Don't need any cue, by the way. That's not too bad. I want to dial that effect back a little bit so it's not quite as obtrusive. I want that subtle. And With the stereo knob, I can kind of widen the stereo effect because the phaser will internally process the left and the right channel of our master bus independently. And with a stereo knob, I can introduce a phase difference between the modulations of those two channels, so that at its most dramatic setting, the phaser in the left channel will be at its lowest, while the phaser in the right channel will be at its highest. So a little bit of that gives me a bit of a more dramatic stereo effect. It's easier to hear at a higher mix ratio. But that's not too bad. I quite like that, I think. So just as a comparison, this is our unprocessed signal. This is a new signal, and you can easily tell the main difference between the chorus and the phaser, because choruses kind of tend to make your signal thicker at normal settings by virtue of the fact that they make copies of it and, add them at various delays. Whereas a phaser is, unless you go crazy with the settings, almost more likely to take out some energy from your signal, because it does introduce those dips, and that's how it creates its movement. So it kind of almost feels like it takes a little bit of bite out of our signal. And that's quite pleasant. Let's go with that. Alrighty. Next step. Let's talk about delays. Delays are awesome. I hope we're all on the same page there. Delays are a great way of adding a sense of spaciousness to an otherwise dry signal, and often do so in a way that can be more transparent than what a reverb would do. You can also use them to add rhythmic interest to any signal that has a discernible pulse or musical meter to it. But we're going to use them in a slightly different manner, because at this point we have 4 different sources of timbral movement in our patch, right? We have the beat frequencies from our detuned oscillator stack, we have our vibrato, we have our filter modulation, and now of course we have our shiny new phaser that's adding its own layer of movement on top of everything. And each of those sources is doing a bang-up job when it comes to keeping things moving. Yeah, B- job when it comes to concealing that we're still listening to a fairly basic synth patch, right? Because especially if you know that they're there, it's fairly easy to focus on any of those elements and point out exactly what they're doing, right? If I'm telling you to kind of focus on the vibrato in this, like, you can immediately tell, okay, there's a... And that's not great, because it's kind of sabotaging like our attempts to convey the sense that we're listening to an ensemble, that old chestnut, like a group of voices where each voice has some sense of independence and is doing its own thing to a point, and is kind of adding its own kind of micro variations that are all coming together to give us a general sense of vibrance, instead of, just a bunch of synced up oscillators with some basic modulation on top. And what a delay allows us to do is, in a very controlled manner, sneak in some extra copies of our signal at various periods or at various points in time, a little bit in the same way that a chorus would do, just without the pitch changing stuff, and at longer delay times, which also allows us to tune those delay times so that in a perfect scenario, the modulations that occur in the delayed signal will hopefully clash and kind of create friction with the same modulations taking place in our original undelayed signal, so that when we blend the two together, we're hopefully getting technically more chaos, but paradoxically that should lead to like a greater sense of like a more homogeneous tone and a more evened out tone. it's a little bit like a waterfall. If you're close enough to make out separate water drops, it's utter chaos. But once you go back 100 meters and view the whole thing from a distance, it kind of turns into a much more even kind of sense of like homogeneous movement, right? That's the theory anyway. Let's see how we fare putting that into practice. So I'm just going to put a standard delay module after our modulation. And for now, I'm just going to go with the default settings, more or less. So this mode gives us 2 delay lines. The third and the fourth one are out of operation in this one. And those are being fed with the left and the right channel. And I can set independent delay times for each of those and also place them in the stereo image wherever I want. So I'm going to start with putting that whole thing into an absolute timescale, because for this application, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to keep that synced up to our tempo. And for starters, I'm going to choose some delay times, maybe in the general range of, I don't know, 400 milliseconds or something. And I'm going to choose slightly different ones for the 2 channels. For now, I'm going to keep them panned hard left, hard right, get rid of the feedback for now, and see what happens when I blend that in with our original signal. Just more or less randomly playing around a little bit with the delay times, see if anything seems to work better. Like, for the record, of course, if there's any specific regular periodic modulation that you want to conceal, it's entirely possible to work out exactly the wavelength of that modulation speed and then kind of derive the delay times that you would need to, clash with that in the perfect way. We're not going to do that now, because honestly, that effect is not that hard to achieve, and you will get something like it at most delay settings. So I'm going to leave that as an exercise. I think that's kind of working. I'm just going to give it a little bit of feedback so that I'm getting more than one repetition. And for this application, it's also often not a bad idea to kind of bandpass filter the delay, the repetitions a little bit with a low pass and a high pass, because the low pass will get rid of like the kind of pinginess in the delay that will make it much more noticeable, and the high pass lets us kind of tame the low end a little bit and make sure that that whole thing doesn't add too much low energy to our signal. I think that's not too bad. I think that works. And by placing the output of those delay lines in my stereo field, I can also kind of make some additional tweaks to the overall kind of width of the ensemble. So I can choose to place them a little bit closer to the center in order to evade that dual mono effect, especially if I'm using slightly different delay lines for left and right. So I think that kind of works. I think that does the trick. So again, as a quick comparison, that's our dry signal. And that's the same with delay. Not too bad. Cool. And now, I mean, for sake of completeness, of course, that trick has its drawbacks. If I do something like this, you can immediately tell what's happening. But I think for a pad, it's reasonably safe to assume that the pros will outweigh the cons. Cool. Which brings us to the final and arguably most important part of our effects chain, which of course is reverb. Any kind of artificial reverberation in whichever shape or form it might come in your synth or your DAW is usually about trying to replicate some of the beneficial and flattering effects that you get as you put a sound source into an actual sonic environment. Usually, like most often, some kind of enclosed space, like a room, right? And some of those effects are a bit easier to explain or more obvious than others. Like on a bass level, a reverb with kind of its dense reverb trail is giving us yet another source of kind of blur and diffusion, much in the same way as the delay does. So it kind of has a way of sanding off like any remaining rough spots in our sound. It's also like especially with longer reverb trails, you can get a sense of like that they're almost putting a little bit of a halo, like a sonic bloom around the contours of your sound that can be quite pleasing. But there's also something to be said about our hearing kind of craving that kind of information about in which spatial context a sound is taking place. And we get that kind of cues from the reverb, from the reflections that are kind of baked into a sound. And if that's entirely absent, it can be a little bit hard to give our sound like a defined sense of dimension and kind of convey to the listener on which plane of existence it takes place, which might be what you want. This is, of course, not to say that any sound will automatically benefit from having reverb on it, of course. But that being said, I would say there are, well, let's not call them sounds. Let's call them like sonic contexts in which reverb is kind of non-optional. If we go back to our standard go-to example of a string ensemble, whenever you've heard a recording of a beautiful, lush and wide string section, I can almost guarantee you that there was some significant room information in that recording, either from mics that were specifically set up to capture the reflections that are coming off of the walls, or from artificial reverberation. And if you've ever had the chance of listening to an actual dry string recording, either one that's coming entirely from closed mics or from like a recording that took place in an anechoic chamber or something, it's very different than that canonical string sound, right? It tends to be a little bit thin and scratchy, and it doesn't really do the voice or the sound of the instrument much justice, because at the end of the day, those, like any orchestral instruments, those things are kind of built to interact with like a chamber or a concert hall around them. Like they're built with that in mind and are not really meant to sound in a free field. So if you just tuned in, welcome to Jan makes fiery defenses of extremely beloved and popular audio effects that we're all overusing anyway. Okay, so let's have a look what Zebra has on offer for reverb. So we have a choice between two different reverb engines. Rev, I think, is a holdover maybe even from Zebra 1 days. I'm not sure. I wasn't really around at that time. Well, I was around, but I didn't have Zebra. So that's an older reverb processor, and the newer one is called New Rev, as you might have. Anyway, so as far as actual room simulation goes, New Rev is kind of just objectively the more competent one. Like, it has much smoother trail and just sounds more believable. But that being said, I'm kind of still glad that they're both around, because Rev can be pretty cool in the right situations. Rev gives me a lot of vibes of like the first generation of affordable like home studio quality digital reverb processors, and it's kind of prone to creating the same kind of metallic ringing artifacts, but in the right scenario, that can be a very useful color to have in its own right. But when it comes to this kind of very smooth and warm patch, I feel like it might be a little bit out of place. So let's go with New Rev instead. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put it all the way to wet, so that we're only hearing the reverb trail. And one of the irritating aspects of that thing is that it has a very, very low output level. And I'm going to try to roughly dial in settings that kind of go a little bit in a kind of concert hall direction. Maybe something like that. A little bit of pre-delay, just to decouple our reverb trail from our dry signal. As usual with the width knob, you know the drill by now. Like, if I go to 100%, it's kind of prone to giving us that dual mono effect, so I'm usually backing off a little bit to avoid that. All right, and once I'm happy with the reverb trail, maybe it's still a little bit on the right side, I'm going to see if I can dial in a good mix between the dry and the wet one. That doesn't sound too bad to my ears. And this dry-wet setting looks very dramatic, just as if we're listening to actually much more wet signal than dry. But keep in mind that our wet signal is like 12 dB lower than our dry signal for some reason. So in other words, at this position, we might actually be closer to a relatively even mix of the two. Cool. That works. All right. So at this point, I guess what's left to do is have a quick look at the EQ and see if we can do something useful with it. So I kind of feel like we still have a little bit of a hint of boxiness in our sound, which is a thing that kind of makes me think of the of like the 300, 400 hertz range. So maybe I can put a little bit of a dip there. Just to further slim out our sound a little bit. We compensate a little bit for it to try and give it a little bit of a bump in those. Okay, that's too much. A little bit more of that silky high end. Try to not overdo it. I overdid it. That's all right. That works for me. Honestly, there's not that much kind of science to this part. Like, unless you are going with like insanely large boosts or anything like that, there's not a lot that you can do wrong per se. Just, go with whatever feels right. Cool. So I would call this a perfectly nice and functional little effects chain that we've got going here. And with that in place, I would also say that at this point, the foundation of our patch is pretty much, cast and dried. Actually, I don't know anything about building stuff. That's what you do with a foundation, right? You cast it and you let it dry. Anyway, so at this point, let's have a quick look into the second layer, because there's not all that much going on there, and what is there actually kind of fits in with the general effects theme of this episode. So the second layer, like quite simply, is the result of me in the creation of the original patch saying, okay, this is nice, this is neat, I like the basic sound, is just still a little bit on the plain side. So let's see if we can add a little something and make it a little bit more characterful and interesting. But at the same time, it was kind of important to me at this point that whatever I would add wouldn't change too much about the basic tonal balance of the patch. Because, well, as I said too often at this point, I'm really digging that it's happening mostly in the lower end of the spectrum and in the first couple harmonics. Which of course doesn't mean that I can't do nifty stuff in the rest of the spectrum. It just means that I'm going to have to take care to clearly keep that in the background. And that's the whole idea behind the second patch. Find something cool to happen in the upper ranges of the spectrum. And I was thinking of something like in abstract terms, like something that gives me like a kind of a swirly haze or like a very diffuse kind of. Definitely something that more is more of an atmospheric element and doesn't really register as something that has a clear tonality to it. And I'm kind of doing that in the cheapest way possible, because instead of actually coming up with something new, I went back to the unfiltered output of our oscillator, because remember, without the filter, our oscillator still sounds like that. So we clearly already have the upper frequency content. We're just filtering it out by default. So why not try to build on that and take that and do something else with it? And being a modular synth, Zebra lets you tap into any point of an existing signal chain and split the signal off into a new chain and do something else with it in parallel to the original chain. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to make a little gap here, and then in our second signal lane, I'm going to add a second filter module. And that module, I'm going to tell that it's supposed to get its input signal from whatever's happening above that module in the first lane, i.e. our unfiltered oscillator signal. So the base signal or the signal that should be the base for the second layer, I want that to be the isolated upper portions of the frequency range. I don't want that to overlap too much with what's happening in the first layer. So in other words, I want it to stay away as much as possible from our fundamental and the very early overtones, just because, well, that's the first layer's turf. I don't want it to step on that. So I'm going to turn this new filter into a bandpass. A high pass would also be a valid choice. I feel like a bandpass is giving us a little bit more options and a little bit more control about the exact frequency range that we want there. And it also lets us use the Q-band model. So real quick, in Zebra's standard VCF modules, there's two different choices for bandpass, the res band and the Q-band model. The really cool thing about the Q-band model is that it kind of repurposes the resonance control and turns it into a knob that lets us directly control the bandwidth of the filter's passband. So as long as that is sitting at 0, I'm going to isolate that real quick. The filter is letting through a relatively wide swath of frequencies, and as I turn that up, the range that it lets through gets progressively narrower, rural juror, well, less passy, and up to like the maximum where I can almost isolate, the various overtones in my signal. So that's really cool. I use that all the time. I really like that. But I do want it to let through a little bit of a larger range. And before I do the final tuning, in this application, it's kind of important that this filter's passband always stays in the same relative position of our overtone spectrum, because remember, the purpose here is to kind of keep it out of the range of our fundamentals. So in other words, it needs to move around with what I'm playing. So before I start with the actual adjustments, I'm going to put key follow all the way up so that it follows along with the notes that I'm playing. And now I can compare the output of that filter to the original and just try to put it into a range where it doesn't really interfere and instead kind of complements what's happening on the first layer. Maybe somewhere there. Just for the record, in the final patch, this layer will be much, much more quiet. I'm leaving the volume there in the middle for now so that we can hear what we're doing. So that works for me. I kind of have a feeling that as I go up in the range, I'm going to shift this passband into ranges where there's very little tonal information left. So to counteract that, I can go a little bit easier on the key follow. Of course I need to compensate for that. As long as I still manage to isolate it and keep it out of the range of the first layer in all of the useful ranges of our patch, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, that works for me. A little bit higher. And now that we've pinned down what should be the source material for our new layer, we can start thinking about how that will fit in and kind of interact with what is already there. And the first thing that occurs to me is that I don't think it's optimal that those two layers are being introduced at the exact same point in time when I play a note, because that kind of fuses them together and makes things sound fairly static. And I think it would be more effective to introduce them in a slightly more staggered fashion so that we can leave the grand entrance to our main actor, the first layer, and then once we had the chance to settle into the sound for a few moments, then we can gradually bring up our new layer, our background. And that's easy enough to do. I can just switch the envelope that's controlling the output level of our new audio lane to a new one. And for this new one, I'm going to start by roughly copying the times from our original first envelope, like that, but then give it a longer attack time. And just as an aside, at its default mode, those envelope generators are, by the way, I've heard both envelope and envelope. Am I sounding pretentious when I keep calling them envelope? Like, the native speakers, let me know. Anyway, so at this mode, all of the timing controls of these generators are non-linear. They work in a cubic characteristic, which means that even pushing them a little bit can easily double or triple the times that you're adjusting, making this a drastically longer attack time than this. So let's check that out. And you might not even perceive it as that much of a delay, right? But if you compare that to how it was before, you can tell that we now have a little bit more of a discernible development in our sound and a little bit more of an arc of tension, right? So that's a good start. Next up, I wanted to make things swirl, right? So I want to have much more movement in this layer. And as a matter of fact, I feel like I can go much more dramatic with this layer than I could with the first layer, because I don't have to worry about our fundamental frequency and the first couple harmonics, i.e. the foundation of our sound. So there's no danger of me messing too much with the tonal stability of our sound. And I can go really crazy with this. So let's explore a couple strategies to make things move around in an interesting way. And first up, in the spirit of trying to achieve the most with the least amount of modules, let's add some filter modulation. And I was thinking, since this layer is supposed to have this slightly otherworldly kind of ethereal, hazy quality, why not, instead of just fading it up, make it, kind of hovering in from above into the sound? And I can do this by reusing our new envelope and using it to set up a negative modulation on our filter cutoff. Maybe like that. And that's giving me this lovely little filter sweep at the beginning of a note, so that the range that we are processing in this layer is kind of starting at a higher point and then gradually settles like into a lower range, right? And of course, I want that to land on the original timbre that I had. So as usual, envelopes are unipolar modulators, meaning that with a sustain level of 100, once I am in the sustain level, I am subtracting 10 semitones from our cutoff value. So I'm just going to add 10 to this. So now it's really kind of sweeping in from above and then settling on our original adjustment. So that's a good start. It gives us a little bit more interest happening there. Downside is, once we're in that sustain phase, nothing happens anymore, right? I mean, we're like, the nice thing is that it will also disappear into the heavens once we're in the release phase. But during the sustain phase, things are back to, static again. And one thing we can do against that is, why go with 100% sustain level? Let's go a little bit down with that, maybe to slightly more than half. And then give the envelope now I'm a little bit self-conscious about that word, give that thing an equally long decay time. Maybe something like that. So now we're getting this kind of flow and ebb motion, right? It's coming in, hitting its maximum modulation value, and then gradually settling down a little bit. And then coming to a rest at kind of half its modulation range. So that's cool, but, it doesn't solve the problem. It still comes to a rest eventually, and things stop moving. And that's not great, because with a pad sound, we kind of always have to be prepared for somebody, putting that down in their arrangement for a minute. So I don't really want things to stop moving at any point. So the next thing that we can do to, further make our envelope more complex is give the sustain phase a bit of a fall or rise that I can do with this control. That's a little bit outside the scope of a traditional ADSR envelope. So the idea here is that once I set this to a different value than the default 0, our sustain level will gradually rise or fall. And so if I put that to like a relatively low positive value, it means that once the sustain level begins, like now, it will then gradually return to the full modulation value, like to a level of 100. So that gives us like one segment more, getting there. So now we have a few seconds of interesting modulation going on, but after those few seconds, we're back to that old problem. So I would much rather keep that going indefinitely, this motion. And an obvious solution would be to slap a LFO on top of that envelope modulation and use that. But there's another way in which I could get around wasting a whole LFO on that, because Zebra lets you loop certain segments of your envelope. And that I can do with this control. The idea here is that it gives me a variety of different parameters that I can assign to this knob, and that will all affect the progress of that envelope in various different ways. And if I set this to the loop D mode, loop decay, it will make it so that once the sustain level has risen back to its full amount, the envelope will then loop back to the beginning of the decay level, which of course is designed to take over at 100% modulation range. I can do that with a delay. That's what the knob is for now, but I don't actually want that. I just want the sustain level to gradually rise by virtue of that 0.5 in the rise control. And once it's done, once it's hit back 100%, then we're going to loop the whole thing around back to the decay. That's the attack. That's the decay. That's the sustain rise. And then we're back to decay. And voila, that's giving us a constant ebb and flow motion that kind of keeps things interesting in the background. Cool. So that's nice, but I wanted to go a little bit more dramatic. That's what I said, right? So let's see if there's other ways in which we can get things to swirl. And there's literally like 1,000 different ways in which you can make signals move around in Zebra, of course. And one of the simplest and also kind of more satisfying ones is the SB module. So SB stands for sideband, and what this module is a frequency shifter. And frequency shifters are really nifty toys that probably deserve their own episode at some point, along with their slightly more stuffy and academic cousins, the ring modulators. So just in a nutshell, a frequency shifter lets you move every single frequency in your signal, in your spectrum, up or down by a constant amount on the frequency scale. So you can use it to, let's say, add or subtract 50 hertz or 100 hertz to every single frequency. And that might make it sound at least related to a pitch shifter, but it's very much not, because the thing about a pitch shifter is that it will leave the harmonic relationships between your frequencies intact. Meaning that no matter where you shift your signal with a pitch shifter, two frequencies that were, let's say, an octave apart in your input signal will still be an octave apart in your output signal. It's just that that octave will be transposed to somewhere else. And what that means is that the pitch shifter will leave the overtone structures of more complex sounds, of harmonic sounds, intact, and hence their timbres. And that's very much not the case for a frequency shifter. If you feed a harmonic waveform, anything that's more complex than a sine wave, anything that has overtones into a frequency shifter, like, for example, this. I'm just going to open the filter a little bit so that we can hear that, and then start shifting that around by any significant amount. Then the frequency shifter will happily shift all your frequencies out of their positions in the natural harmonic series, and leave you with this delightfully inharmonic, metallic, clangy mess. Which rules, let's be honest, but it's also not super useful for our use case. But the second kind of crowd-pleasing party trick of this thing is, if we shift that signal by only a minuscule amount, let's say something like half a hertz or something, and then blend that shifted signal in with our original unshifted one, then this happens. Ain't that cool? So what's happening here is that we're effectively creating a new detune. And I've talked about it a little bit in the last episode. Wherever there's a detune, you will also get beat frequencies. And beat frequencies occur at the difference between the two frequencies that cause it, that by interacting with each other. So that's kind of what's behind this effect. But the thing that makes this case special is that our detune signal is coming from a frequency shifter, meaning that the difference between the frequencies that are creating those beat frequencies will be constant throughout the entirety of our spectrum, which of course means that the rates of the beat frequencies will also be constant. And that's the reason why, instead of small detuning values giving us like a chaotic warble and larger ones giving us, a full-on ensemble effect, this detuning will give us this kind of impossibly smooth phasery effect. And we can make this even more awesome. I know I'm gushing. I really like this thing. Deal with it. We can make this even more awesome by shifting the frequencies into one direction in the left channel and into another on the right channel. We can do this by using the offset button. And that's kind of bringing that whole thing into like the stereo dimension, so that we're getting this really nice, kind of the epitome of swirl, this really nice stereo phaser effect. And that's working without any kind of external modulation, because any movement is being caused by these beat frequencies. And as usual, when that's the case with anything that's related to phasery effects or detuning effects, I can control the rate at which this whole thing is operating by adjusting the amount of frequency shift, the offset button, and the intensity of this effect by controlling the blend between our unprocessed and the processed signal And as usual, the maximum effect will occur when I'm setting this to 50 so that I get an equal blend of those two signals. And honestly, I don't think we need more swirl than that. I think that's pretty cool. Can still see if it gives us a markedly different effect in the other direction. Let me go a little bit lower on the mix. I think this is pretty good. I think in the original I still had like another all-pass filter to just have one more layer of phasing there, but I think that's optional. I think this works pretty well on its own. Nice. And now that I'm happy with what's happening on this layer, I can finally work on kind of integrating it with what's already there. Well, first of all, let me go back to our original bandwidth. And now I can work on tweaking the balance between the first and the second layer. I'm just going to try and tuck this in behind the main layer until it becomes this almost imperceivable additional source of ambience. But it's very much in the background and almost registers more on a subconscious level. At this point, you can almost more notice it once it's gone, right? It's just kind of sitting there as kind of this hazy cloud in the background that adds just a little bit of ambience and atmosphere and movement and interest to our sound. And that's our second layer. And that is gonna do it for the second episode. Folks, thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this one. Of course, we're still not quite done yet with this patch. In the next episode, we're gonna wrap things up with a closer look at the third and final layer. And that's also when we're gonna dive into some dope modulation tricks, not to toot my own horn. Actually, I think that's my job description. As always, you can find this and all other episodes on my Soundware label's website, treeswiftaudio.com, which of course is also where you can get my sound sets. Once again, that offer code is Quiltmaster. You can find out about my music and my general whereabouts on janmorgenstern.com. You can follow me in all the usual places, Facebook, Twitter, Mastodon as of lately. Still hanging with a cool crowd. If you have any kind of feedback, questions, suggestions, if you would like me to tackle any specific technique, or if you would like to see your favorite patch featured in a future episode, do let me know in the comments below. Hey, if you like this and would like to see more of it in the future, then subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with all your friends. In fact, share it with all your enemies, especially those with not a lot of patience. All right. I really hope that I'm going to see you around for the next episode of Jan's Patchwork Corner. And until then, I'm Jan Morgenstern. Have a good one. Bye-bye.